Right. Okay. Let's carry on from where we left off last week. Somebody asked me a question last week. I can't remember who was asked me the question, but I remember the question. The question, it might have been Julia. The question was, did ordinary people live in the cities of refuge, or was it only Levium and criminals? And so I said I would look it up, and I did. And the answer is yes, ordinary people did live in the cities of refuge. Michael told us that there were 82.9 accidental deaths per million in the UK last year. So depending on how long the Cohen Godel lasted, there may have been a few hundred, or I suppose maximum a couple of thousand criminals there. Bearing in mind that these cities were not metropolitan cities like Netanya with a lot of residents. Anybody know how many residents Netanya has?
I think it's 500,000, isn't it?
No.
320,000.
Not a bad guess, that. 270,000. So these cities that we're talking about are very small. I think I've told you this before. I went on a tiul a couple of years ago to a place called Sha'arayim, the biblical city of Sha'arayim, which is mentioned. I think we might even be going to mention it. I think we've already mentioned it, I think, in our Tanakh share, but I think we're going to mention it again later on. It's down near David and Goliath country, near Bet Shemesh, and it's called Sha'arayim because it's got an unusual feature. Why do you think it's called Sha'arayim?
2 gates.
Correct. It's got 2 gates. Now, that's unusual to have 2 gates in a city. Why is it unusual to have 2 gates in a city?
You're muted, Michael.
Yes, Michael.
So you normally only have 1?
Yes, that's true. Why do you only have 1?
For protection, because it's you can control the access.
Yeah, it's the weakest point. The gate is the weakest point of the city. City is surrounded by thick walls. There has to be a way of getting in and out. So the gate, usually made of wood, is the weakest point. So you would also want to control access in and out, but you would also want to limit the weak point. So it's unusual to have 2 gates in a city. And that's why the city was called Sha'arayim, because it was the city that had 2 gates. And why do you think it had 2 gates?
It was on the main road between 2 places?
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. Another reason why you might have had 2 gates.
Quick exits?
Yeah, because it
was a very busy place.
Yeah, it was a big place. It was a big place. It was relatively speaking, it was a big city. And so it needed 2 gates, an eastern and a western gate, or a southern and a northern gate. I can't remember now which it was. But either way, it was on the biggish side for cities. And we went to this tiul and we walked all around the city, the whole circumference of the city. How long do you think it took us?
Half an hour.
Not much more, about 40 minutes. It was tiny. It's tiny. And this was a big city. So when we think of cities, we have to stop thinking of, London and New York, or even Iriamim and Poleg. These cities were small. They were small places. And a lot of people lived outside of the city walls in the unprotected areas. So when we think of 150, 300 people in a city, criminals in a city, that might have been quite a big proportion of the population. We read all sorts of figures in the Tanakh which are not to be taken literally. Like 40,000 soldiers died on one day, and it's impossible. These kind of figures that you read in the Torah are not we've had this discussion before, but they're not to be taken literally. One of these days I will do a full series on numbers in the Tanakh, but I need to reread Joshua Berman's book that David Marks kindly gave me, because he deals with that in superb detail. Any of you ever get an opportunity to, he does trips as well as lectures and writes books, Rabbi Joshua Berman. If you ever get a chance to go and hear him, absolutely superb. And he has a whole chapter in his book about the numbers in the Torah. And once I've fully got my head around it, because it's complicated, I will try and pass that on. Anyway, the answer to the question is that the cities were ordinary cities. They were administered by the Leviim. Anyone could live there, and it was the place where the accidental murderers were sent off to. Okay, so that's answered the question. Julia, have you got another question for us? No. Okay. Right. So if you remember where we were up to, and I gave you a warning at the end of last week's share that this is complicated now. So you have to have your wits about you. So we are discussing the makeup of the small Sanhedrin, which consists of 23 judges. And the Mishnah asked a question: how do you get to 23? And we got so far to 20. Remember, we spoke about the word Eidah being a congregation. And from the spies story, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, stand aside from this evil congregation, Eidah Hara'ah, this evil congregation. We know that there were 10 of those spies who were not good. After Joshua and Caleb had stood aside, there were 10. From there, we learn that a congregation is 10. That's where we learn the origin of a minyan from. And we brought the pasuk which spoke about a congregation judging, and the word congregation, Eidah, was used twice. And so 2 10s are 20. That's where we got to, as far as 20. And now the Gemara is asking us over here on, I haven't shared the screen with you.
Share the screen.
Yeah. I just realized I didn't share it with you. Got it?
Yeah, thank you.
So there we go. There's our little S shaped here. That's where we're up to here. So the Gemara says, Minayin lahavi od shlosha. Where is the scriptural source for bringing a further 3 judges? We know we're up 20 because we've got that so far. Eidah and Eidah, 10 plus 10 is 20. Where do you get the other 3 from? That's what the Gemara says. Now, like we did last week, we have to go back to the Mishnah. We have to go back in time 3.5 years to the Mishnah to understand the question of the Gemara. So I'm going to whiz you back to page 9. It might be 10, actually. Hang on. Yes, it's page 10.
Page 10, yeah.
We progressed. Okay. So here in the top part of here is what we did last week. Where do we get the 10 from? Where do we get the 20 from? 2 lots of 10. And we did all that. So now the Mishnah says, Uminayin lahavi od shlosha. Where do we get that we had 3 judges from? We've done all this. We did it 3.5 years ago, but of course none of us can remember, including me. So we have to redo it. Mimashma net shenema. From the implication, there is a pasuk that says, Lo tiyeh acharei rabim le ra'ot. Now, translated here by Rav Steinsaltz, you shall not follow a multitude to convict. What does that mean? You shall not follow a multitude to convict. What does that even mean in English? No, I don't know either. So we need to go and have a look at the psukim. And helpfully, we are told where it is. If I didn't tell you there helpfully that it's in 23:2 of Exodus, and I made you guess which parasha it's in, what would you guess?
Yitro.
Close, very close. What comes after Yitro? Mishpatim. Mishpatim. Okay, Mishpatim. Yitro introduces the concept of the judges, which is why Michael said that, and it was a very intelligent guess. The parasha after Yitro then goes into the details of all the civil laws. Okay, that's what Mishpatim means, the civil laws. So there it is on the screen for you. Let's look at Jeffrey, if you wouldn't mind reading the screen for us. Start with verse 1, and verse 2 is the main one we're interested in. You're muted, Jeffrey. You're muted. Jeffrey, we can't hear you. Jeffrey, we can't hear you. Jeffrey, you are muted. Now try again.
You shall not accept a false report. Do not place your hand with a wicked person to be a false witness. You shall not follow the majority for evil, and you shall not respond concerning a lawsuit to follow many to pervert justice.
Okay. Is anybody more the wiser, having read that in context, of what it means, you shall not follow the majority for evil?
I just wonder if it's to do with peer pressure, and if you know lots of people are doing wrong things, then you shouldn't follow them. You've got to stand up for what's correct.
That is exactly what I thought too, and it's not correct. But that's exactly what I thought, Julia, and that's what it sounds like to me. It means don't go after the crowd just because the crowd are doing something bad. It's a very difficult thing to do, by the way. And you know what? It may mean that as well. There may be a meaning in there as well of that. For our purposes in the Gemarah, that's not what it means. But I do agree that that is a very sensible interpretation of that passage. Anybody else like to suggest what on earth this means? You shall not follow the majority for evil.
Is it something to do with the jury giving the wrong verdict or something like that, or the judges giving the wrong verdict?
Okay. Well, we are talking about Batei Din, so that is the area that we're in. Of course, the Jewish law does not have a jury of his peers. The Beit Din consists of judges, not jurors. Okay, let's have a look and see what the Gemarah.
Sorry, could it be that if there are two people that have made what the third person thinks is the wrong decision, then you shouldn't go with them. You should stand up for what you believe to be the correct
Okay,
decision.
well, we are getting now closer to the nub of it. Yeah, we're getting there. Not quite what the Gemarah is referring to, but it's along those lines. Let's have a look. Let's go back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, it quotes this pasuk, and what it means is, well, he goes, let's carry on. I did warn you it's complicated, so you have to think, you have to concentrate here. Shomea ani. An interesting expression. It's not a common expression, this in the Gemarah. But what it means is, I would understand. Shomea is to hear, right? But it also means to understand. Okay, so if you say to somebody, I hear you, that means I understand what you're saying. So Shomea ani, from this expression, you shall not follow a multitude to convict, or you shall not follow the majority to do evil. I would understand she'ehye imahem l'tova, that you should follow a majority for good. It's the other side of the coin. The Torah says, don't go after the majority to do evil. Implication, do go after the majority to do good, right? And if we take Julia's explanation, you would say positive peer pressure is a good thing to follow. Yeah, that would make sense. But that's not what it means. What it means is, lo tieh achrei rabim l'ra'ot means you should not follow a simple majority to convict. L'ra'ot means to do evil, to do evil to the defendant, in other words, to convict him. You cannot convict on the basis of a simple majority of one. That is what that pasuk means. Lo tieh acharei rabim, do not go after the majority, in other words, in brackets, a simple majority of one, l'ra'ot, to convict. And then I would understand the opposite. She'ehyeh imayhem l'tovah, that you should, what's the opposite of convict? Exonerate on the basis of a simple majority. So to convict, you need more than a simple majority, but to find somebody not guilty, that can be on the basis of a simple majority of one. Okay, so the question of the Mishnah then says, remember we're in the Mishnah here now, Imkain, if so, Lama Nema, why does it say in the same pasuk, Acharei Rabim Lahatot? After a majority, you should incline. In other words, if for a majority to exonerate, you should go after a simple majority of one. The Mishnah is asking why we needed to say that, because we could imply it from the first part, and the Torah doesn't waste words. So just to recap, the Mishnah says the Pasukim Mishpatim tells us that we need more than a simple majority to convict. Implication that we only need a simple majority to exonerate. But then the Pasuk comes along and says you only need a simple majority to exonerate. Why? Lo kahatayatcha l'tova hatayatcha l'ra'a. It's telling you that your inclination to exonerate, in other words, the majority that you need is not the same as that you need for a conviction. Hatayatcha l'tova al pi echad. The exoneration can be by a majority of one. Now, this is where it gets complicated. Hatayatcha l'ra'a al pi shnayim. On in order to convict, you need a majority of two. Right? Of two. Now, you've got a problem, haven't you? So, what they do is, they say, in order that you have to have a minion on either side. You have to have a possibility that you have 10 people to exonerate who say not guilty, 10 people who say guilty, and you need a majority of 2. So that means you need at least 22 judges. So because you need a majority of 2 to bring a conviction, and you need a possibility that there is at least 10 people who say he's not guilty, then you have to have a minimum of 22. So you bring an extra 2 to the 20 that we've already got. Fine. And how do we get to 23?
Well, you've got to have an odd number.
Got to have an odd number. So we must have at least 22. But ein beit din shakul. We can't have an even number of judges. Mosifim aleim od. We add on one more. od echad, harei kan esrim ushlosha. There we get to 23 judges. Okay, that was the Mishnah. That was the easy bit, right? The Mishnah, in summary, says, how do you know there's 23 judges in a small Sanhedrin? We've got the word Eidah twice, so that's 20. We need to have a majority of at least 2 to convict, with 10 on the other side. So that means we have to have at least 12 to convict. 12 plus 10 is 22. We can't have an even number, so we have 23. All happy? Yes, all happy with that? Well, the Gemarah isn't happy with that, as you can imagine, because it's going to ask us a question. Let's go to page 91, 17, what are we on? 17, Ahmad Aleph. And the Mishnah said, the Gemarah quotes the Mishnah and says, how do you know that we need 3? And it goes and tells us what we've just learned. Okay. Says the Gemarah, sof, the end of the day, l'ra'ah al pi shnayim lo mishkachat la. You cannot find a majority of 2. How can you find a majority of 2 in a bet din of 23? Work it out. You need at least 10 to say he's innocent. So if you have 10 that say he's innocent and 13 that say he's guilty, that's a majority of
3.
3, right? What if you have 11 that say he's innocent, and then you've only got 12 left to say he's guilty, and that's a majority of 1. 12 versus 11. So in a base din of 23 people, you can, and you've got to have 10 that say he's innocent, you can only ever have a majority of either 3, i.e. 10 versus 13, or a majority of 1, 11 versus 12. You with me? You can't have a majority of 2. It doesn't work. So the Gemarah's question is a very good question. The Gemarah says, we've just spent the last 25 minutes showing that you need to have a majority of 2 to convict, and it can't happen the way you've just said. So what's going on? Yes, Julia.
But if you have 20, it's 2 and 21. So you have 2 on one side and 21 on the other side. That makes 23.
Yeah, but then you've got a majority of 19.
No, you've got them.
We're trying to get to a situation where you've got a majority of 2. And on a base din of 23 people.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, I'll go back.
You can't have it. Okay. The Gemarah asks a very good question that none of us thought of. Why are you telling us that it needs to be a majority of 2 when that is a situation that can't occur according to your solution to make 23 judges? Okay. So now the Gemarah introduces another feature of the justice system that none of us here were aware of hitherto. Have a look at this. Let's just do what we've just said inside. If 11 say not guilty and 12 say guilty, akati chadhu, that's a majority of 1. And if it's 10 versus 13, that's a majority of 3. So how's it work? Now, Rabbi Abahu comes along and introduces a new feature that we didn't know about. Amar Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu says, I ata motze ela ba mosifin. We don't find this situation except in a case where they add on additional judges. Can you see the word musaf in there? musifin. Musaf, same word as musaf. Additional, musaf is the additional service. You can only have this situation where you add on to the judges. What's going on? What situation do we have where you add on to the judges? Now, none of us knew this. This is a piece of information about the Sanhedrin that we are now about to learn that we didn't previously know. And it's not stated explicitly in the Gemarah. We're meant to know it. Quite helpfully, Steinsaltz and the Art Scroll explain it to us. And it goes like this. You have a Beis Din of 23 judges. One of them says, I don't know. I'm not sure. And in that situation, he is removed from the equation. He stands down from the Beis Din. And rather bizarrely, they replace him not with one judge, but with two. Not with one judge, but with two judges. Okay. And those two judges then both vote to convict. In that situation, you can have a majority of two, because you now have a Beis Din of 24 people, and you can have 11. I don't know, how does it work? Well, I've lost it now. They add two judges, so you've got 20. You've got 25 judges now, but one of them is not voting because he says, I don't know. So you've got 24 judges. How are you going to get to a majority of two? Let's have a look. I've lost it now. To go back.
11 and 13.
11 and 13. Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, 11 and 13. You've got 11 and 13. Yeah, got it. Yeah. Voting 13 to 11. Rashi tells us that. Yes, well done, Michael. You obviously knew the Rashi.
He's an accountant. He's an accountant.
You now have, fair enough, you now have a majority of two. Now, the obvious question, well, there are two obvious questions, I think. Question number one that's obvious, if one judge can't make his mind up, so what? And if you'll say, well, every judge has to vote, why replace him with two? Why not replace him with one? That's question number one. And question number two is this. When you replace him, you have a Beis Din of 13 versus 11, which is, Michael, our accountant,
An even number.
an even number. And we know you can't have a Beis Din of an even number. So we have a bit of a problem. And I don't know the answer to either of those two questions. I have looked very hard this morning when I was preparing this shiur as to why they had two and why you end up with a Beis Din which is an even number. And it seems to me that the only possible explanation is that this is a specific situation where you have a split court, because in order to get to 11 and 13, you previously had to have 11 versus 11 with one abstention, right? That was the scenario, 11 versus 11 with one abstention. And this poor guy doesn't know how to vote, can't make his mind up. So he's moved out of the situation. And now, in that one and only situation, because of the psukim that we said earlier, we are dealing with a very specific case. It's a capital case. because it's a 23-man panel, court, thank you. It's a 23-man court. And for a capital case, you cannot convict on a majority of two, a majority of less than two. And so therefore, in order to have a possibility of conviction, you have to add in those two judges. And so you have to say that the answer to the first question, which is why not replacing with one, doesn't help, because we know we've got 11 versus 11. Adding one other one will not give us the possibility of either a conviction or an exoneration. You can only ever get an exoneration because you can't convict on less than two, majority of less than two. And so the idea that you can't have an even number of judges has to be put aside for this one very specific case where you have a hung jury, if you'll not jury, a hung court, if you'll pardon the pun, that is 11 versus 11 and one guy who can't make up his mind. It's the only situation where you can have a based-in of more than of an even number, and it's at that specific situation in order to allow the possibility that this court can convict and can exonerate. Because if it can't do it can only do one or the other, it's not a proper court. It's a really interesting concept, this, that we know you can't have a bet din shakul, an even number of judges, except when you can, except when you must. So again, this is an excellent Hanukkah quiz question. When can you have a even number of judges? The answer is when you have a capital case, which is 11 versus 11 with one abstention. That's the only situation, as far as I'm aware, where this comes in. So
can't you argue that you still have 25 judges, even though one is now on the side? He hasn't decided he can't either way. So you've still got 25, despite adding two to it.
Have you read on?
No.
Because that's what the Gemarah says. Gemarah asks that question. So not only does Michael know Rashi, he also knows the whole of Shas. Very impressive. Right, let's go on and see what the Gemarah says. So the question of the Gemarah is, how are you going to do it? So Rabbi Abou says you do it by this idea of mosifin. You take one out and put two in. V'divrei hakol. That is the opinion. This is a possibility of, according to all Tanaim. Divrei hakol. These are the words of everybody. Everybody agrees with that. What's he talking about? He's talking about the two opinions that we had about the Great Sanhedrin. Can you remember the two opinions we had? How many people were in the Great Sanhedrin? There was Rabbi Yehuda who said, how many?
70. It says 70 now.
70. And the Chachamim who said?
71.
Correct. And the argument was whether Moshe was part of the 70 elders or apart from the 70 elders. Okay, that was rather clever language, wasn't it? Was he a part of the 70 elders or apart from the 70 elders? I like that. Okay, anyway, he was one or the other. Rabbi Yehuda says 70, the Chachamim says 71, but Divrei Hakol, meaning both Rabbi Yehuda and Sanhedrin would agree that in the Sanhedrin Katan, you can have this situation of a majority of two. And according to the Rabbi Uve Sanhedrin Gadola, and in the big Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yehuda Amashavim, it fits with the small Sanhedrin according to everybody, and it even fits with the big Sanhedrin. according to Rabbi Yehuda, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, there are 70 in the big Sanhedrin. So if you have 70 in the big Sanhedrin, you can have a majority of 2. And I've worked it out even before Michael's told me. It's 36 versus 34 if in your big Sanhedrin. You can't do that with a Sanhedrin of 71. You can't have a majority of 2 without somebody having to abstain. So that was really interesting. Don't you think that was really interesting? So let's carry on. V'amar Rabbi Abahu. Since we mentioned Rabbi Abahu, he was the one that enlightened us on this new concept of an abstaining judge being replaced by 2 other judges. Since we mention him, while we're at it, we'll mention something else that he says. V'amar Rabbi Abahu, and Rabbi Abahu says as well, B'mosifin, when they do add in these additional judges, osin beit din shakol lechatchila, they make a even numbered beit din ab initio, which means lechatchila, right? Means in the first place. It's not. It's there as a first option. Okay. And we've got very helpfully here a little note from Rabbi Steinsaltz on the left-hand side. In a case where a lesser Sanhedrin does not reach a decisive majority with regard to a capital case, because there were 12 judges who voted to convict and 11 who voted to acquit, or even if all voted to convict but one said, I don't know, 2 additional judges are added to the court. If after the addition the judges remain unable to reach a decisive majority, the accused is acquitted. Some authorities hold that in such a case, more judges are added 2 by 2 until the size of the court reaches 71. So that's just another side issue. So Rabbi Abahu says, when you add in your 2 judges, you've got an even number. Lechatchila. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Why are you telling me that? That's obvious. You take off 1, you add 2, 23 minus 1 is 22, plus 2 is 24. That's an even number. I don't need Rabbi Abahu to tell me that. That's obvious, says the Gemara. Says the Gemara, no, it's not quite as obvious as you might think. Mahu de tema. What might have I thought? What might I have thought? Hai de ka'ama, eini yodea. I might have thought, Michael, this is for you, right? This is for you. I might have thought the one that says eini yodea, I don't know, I'm not sure, I need to abstain. Kaman de ite dame. He might be viewed as somebody who is still part of the court. The iama milta, and if he then says something, in other words, he brings a point about the case, he mentions something and he raises a point of discussion about the case, shaminan lay, we would listen to him. So you might think that, as Michael said, even though he's abstaining, he's still part of the court, and therefore it's not an even court, it's an odd court of 25. That's what you might have thought, and in fact it's what Michael did think. But the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, it comes to teach you. Rabbi Abahu is saying to you, no, Dahaika Amar Eini Yodea, the one who says, I don't know, and abstains, Kaman Delete Dame. He is like somebody who isn't there. It's as if he has stepped aside. Ve'iyama Tama, and if he brings forward some kind of reasoning on the case, Lo Shaminan Lei. You don't listen to him. He no longer has the jurisdiction to comment on the case. He is off the case, as you would say. All right, he's been stood down, and therefore, if he's stood down, then lechatchila, ab initio, it is an even-handed based in. So Michael's question was a very good question, which the Gemara asks, but the Gemara answers it by saying you might have thought that he is still part of the case, as Michael thought, but he's not. He's stood down completely, and therefore you've got 22 plus your 2 is 24. Okay, that is the end of that. Good, says Julia. Any questions on that rather complicated but fascinating topic? Any questions? No? Right. Okay, we will move on from the mathematical... Michael, got a question.
Sorry, isn't it highly unlikely that somebody would abstain in a case like this, because the Sanhedrin normally would say not to convict if it's a very serious offence, wouldn't they? And particularly if it's a capital offence.
Okay, interesting. Okay, we're talking about a very difficult case here. Why do we know it's a very difficult case? Because it's 11 versus 11 on one abstention. So it's not a clear-cut business, right? It's obviously, there are obviously sides to convict and sides to exonerate, 11 versus 11, and one guy just says, just don't know. I'm torn. So you're saying, Michael, is, well, if you haven't got a jury of, if you haven't got a verdict of a majority of 2, then you can't convict, and therefore you should exonerate. Well, that's what you would think. No majority of 2, but what they want to do is to give a possibility of a majority of 2.
I was not actually saying that. I was saying that they were talking about the Sanhedrins over time, that to convict for a capital offence was very, very rare. If they convicted once in a Sanhedrin, that was not a very good sign. So therefore, I would have thought that this person who is wavering between convicting or not convicting would normally have said, okay, I'm not sure about it, therefore I will vote not to convict, and therefore it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, so you're influenced, I think, by the English court system, criminal justice system, which says that you can only convict on the basis of beyond reasonable doubt. And what you're saying is, and it makes sense, that this guy, this judge, is saying to himself, I can't say he's guilty beyond reasonable doubt. I'm just not sure. And by definition, if it is not beyond reasonable doubt, then in English law, you can't vote to convict. So what you are saying is accurate and influenced by the English approach of criminal justice, which is to be beyond reasonable doubt. It's not beyond reasonable doubt, and therefore you cannot convict. There is no such concept of beyond reasonable doubt in halakha. It is, you take it to court and the judges make their decision, yes or no. And if they can't make a decision, and they're not able to make a decision, then they must stand aside. And then you bring your extra 2 in. So I think that's the situation, that it's a different approach to justice. But you'll see in a minute.
So it's got nothing to do with the fact that the Sanhedrin, if they convicted of murder once in the life of the Sanhedrin, it would be deemed to be it's not a vicious Sanhedrin, cruel Sanhedrin. Therefore, I would have thought under those circumstances is that, as that would have been a cruel Sanhedrin, that somebody would be inclined, if in doubt, they would tend to vote against. Forget about the English law at the moment. I'm just thinking about the Sanhedrin convicting somebody to death.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's true. But I don't think it's a question of doubt. You've got the halachic rules, okay? Did they get a warning? Were there two witnesses? Were the witnesses kosher witnesses? And all the things that you have to do to convict. And if any of those don't fit, then it's not, I'm not sure, it's out. So I think the situation of a judge not being sure is a very rare thing, because we're dealing with facts. And unless you can show a fact, okay, it's a fact. Were there two witnesses? Yes or no? Were those two witnesses kosher witnesses? Yes or no? Did they do the appropriate warning at the time? Yes or no? And it's broken down into bite-sized little bits of information, which have all got a binary answer. And so it would be unusual to get a situation where you have, I'm not sure if he did it or not, because it doesn't matter whether you think he did it or not. The question is, are there two kosher witnesses that said, I saw him do it, I warned him, I saw him do it, and he did it anyway? It's not like in an English legal system where the jury or the judge has to decide, well, on the balance of probabilities, beyond reasonable doubt or whatever, I think you did it. That's not good enough in Jewish law. There has to be two witnesses. There have to be two kosher witnesses. Those kosher witnesses have to have done a specific type of warning. And it's almost like a tick box. It's a protocol you have to go through. And if any of those boxes are not ticked, it's booted out on a technicality, as it were. So it would be very unusual to have a judge who's not sure. Because it's not, you're not asking the judge to say, Judge Michael Krauss, do you think he did it or not? That's not the question. It's Judge Michael Krauss, do you think all the elements that are required to convict him are present?
So I can't see then, under those circumstances, I can't see a situation where he would be wavering between one or the other. You said it's black and white, either yes or no.
It is binary, and that's why it's so unusual. I suppose you could have a case of somebody saying, well, I'm not sure whether those words that he said at that time were an appropriate warning or not. That's the, or I'm not sure whether he constitutes a kosher witness, maybe he was a murderer himself and he's no longer, or maybe he's a relative, or there could be some doubt somewhere along the line. But you're right.
It must be very close, John, if it's talking about 11 against 12. It's obviously a very, very close thing. Very close.
So there's obviously some element of doubt somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, what we're going to talk about next in the last few minutes this week and go on to next week is a fascinating piece of legal acrobatics, which is going to shock Julia to the core. Okay, and so be prepared to be shocked, Julia, right? And we'll start it this week and we will go on. Now, listen to this. Listen to this. We're starting over here where our little F here. I'm a Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says, Sanhedrin shera'u kulan l'chova potrinoto. In a Sanhedrin where all of them, all the judges say that he is chova, guilty. A unanimous verdict, 23-0. Potrinoto, he is acquitted. Yes? Julia, shocked to your core? Yes, Julia is shocked. As we all should be. Hang on a minute. You've got a case here where you've got a majority of 2. 13 versus 11 in our extended based-in, right? And they convict. So 13 versus 11 convicts. In our regular based-in of 23, you've got 10 versus 13 convicted. 9 versus 14 convicted, etc., etc., etc. 1 versus 22 convicted, guilty. All of them say he's guilty. He's set free. He's acquitted. What on earth is going on?
A technicality.
Okay, you're not allowed to look on now. I'm taking it off the screen. Okay, who can explain this weird piece of law that says that when there is a unanimous verdict to convict a prisoner, a defendant, then he is acquitted and he walks free from the court? How on earth can you explain that? Julia, what kind of technicality are you getting him off on?
Well, it was one of the ones that you mentioned before, that the witnesses weren't kosher. Or
No, there's no question about that. All the 23 judges have said they were kosher judges. They were proper warnings. The guy is guilty as charged, with witnesses, with warnings. Shalom al Yisrael, guilty. 23 of them say he's guilty. He walks free.
Mental incapacity?
Okay. Mental incapacity. So he's guilty, but he's mitigated on the grounds of insanity. All right? Maybe
but why would 23 vote in favour then? Why would 23 vote in favour then?
So they were. So I think what Julia was saying is they're voting in favour that he's guilty, but he's not guilty of a capital crime because he wasn't in possession of his senses at the time. Okay, that's not what we're talking about, but I think that's it's a good
diminished responsibility. Is it called?
Diminished responsibility, insanity plea. I think they call it in America. Do we have an insanity plea in the UK? Don't know. We certainly have diminished responsibility. I'm involved in a case actually at the moment of a terrible case where a young man was psychotic, and during an episode of psychosis, he killed his grandmother, and he was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. And Nebuch will not see the light of day again because he's in a secure unit, and it's a terrible, terrible case. What's got to do with me? Well, the doctors the doctors allegedly did not treat him when he first had his psychosis and allowed the psychosis to go untreated, and as a result, he got worse and killed his grandmother. It's a terrible, terrible case. But anyway, that's the grounds of diminished responsibility. So that's not what we're talking about here. It's a fascinating subject, this. We are going to stop there because I want to go into it in detail next week, and I don't want to give you a clue as to what we're talking about. It's a fascinating idea that a majority of, a unanimous verdict can be result in an acquittal. And just to give you a little taster, I found online, which I haven't yet finished reading, which is another reason we're not going into it today, because I haven't fully finished reading it. And an article here from 2013 in a Pace University School of Law, a scholarly article entitled "The Unanimous Verdict According to the Talmud: Ancient Law Providing Insight into Modern Legal Theory" by Ephraim Glatt. He sounds like he might be Unzera, right? One of us. He's an associate at Kasowitz, Benson, Torres and Friedman, LLP, Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. He's also got rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University. He's got a BA from Yeshiva University, and he's obviously a rather clever fellow. And he has written this article, which I'm going to read in detail. If anybody would like to read this before next week, I will now, right this minute, put the link on the Leon Bennett Sanhedrin group. There it is. If anybody wants to read it, you can. If you don't want a spoiler on the Gemarah, then don't read this, because he goes into our Gemarah in detail. It's absolutely fascinating, and that's what we'll do next week. So whoever said the Gemarah is boring and old-fashioned does not know what they're talking about. Any questions so far? Yes, David.
Sorry, I'm muted.
There you go. We can hear you.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm totally lost by the previous piece of Gemarah, and the concept of having an uneven number of judges in the case where judges are added. Can I start off going back to the verse that we quoted from Parashat Mishpatim?
Yeah.
My understanding of that is that in a capital case, a mere majority is sufficient to acquit, but to condemn, a majority of 2 is required.
Correct.
Okay, that didn't come out, I don't think. Maybe it wasn't meant to come out there.
Yeah, it was meant to come out there. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. That's what this pasuk means.
Or maybe you've covered this before. Okay, the odd and even numbers. I need to look at this more closely, because it's a mission at the beginning of chapter 5 of Sanhedrin, this particular occurrence. So are we saying that the judge who abstains for whatever reason is actually stood down? I mean, the wording in the Mishnah seems to imply that he's not stood down, he remains on the court, but because he's abstained, he can't subsequently add anything. He's got to keep stum. So there are there are 2 judges added, which maintains the odd number, but the even number is the fact that only an even number are subsequently allowed to vote. Okay. Have I understood that correctly?
You have understood that correctly, except that that doesn't make any sense, in that if the guy who's not allowed to say anything about the case and he's not allowed to vote, then you can call him part of the Beis Din, you can call him what you like, but he's not part of the Beis Din. He's not voting. Correct. He's not voting, and he's not saying anything. So effectively, he's stood down, even if practically he's not stood down. The whole point of Ein Beit Din Shakul, of not having an even number, is that you shouldn't have an even vote of 12-12. Okay? So if you're going to say, okay, well, we've still got an odd number because he counts and we've got 25 judges now, well, that doesn't help you, because only 24 are allowed to vote. So
that's my point.
Correct. So it's an anomaly. And that's what I was trying to explain earlier on, is that the anomaly can only happen in this very rare case where you have a capital case where you have 11 versus 11 and 1 abstention. It's the only time you can do that, because any other situation, you've got your majority of 2 to convict, or you've got your majority of 1 to exonerate. The only situation you haven't is if you've got 11 versus 11 and 1 abstention. And so in that very specific situation, the Beit Din Shakul is put to one side. Why? Because actually we need a Beit Din Shakul to have a possibility of a majority of 2. Now, you'll see later on, or maybe not later on, maybe I read it in the Meforshim, that one of the opinions is, to solve the whole problem, is that Rabbi Abahu is wrong, and the whole beginning is wrong, and that when it says acharei rabim l'raot. What's the expression? Lo tieh acharei rabim l'raot. Don't go after the majority. It's not talking about majority of 2. It's talking about majority of 3. There is an opinion that says that there it's talking about majority of 3 because you can't have a bet din shakul. So one thing has to give. Either it's a majority of 2, or the idea that you can't have an even number has to give, because you can't get a majority of 2 with an odd number of judges unless somebody abstains. So those two things are mutually exclusive. So something has to give. Rabbi Abahu's opinion is the idea that you can't have an even number of judges is the thing that gives. And in our specific scenario, that gives. Another opinion, I can't remember who it was now, where I read it, is that Rabbi Abahu's opinion is wrong, and what gives is the 2, the majority of 2, and in order to convict, you need a majority of 3, and that you can't have a bet din shakul. The bet din shakul is written in stone, as it were, and cannot be put aside. It can only be one of those 2 situations. The 2 things are mutually exclusive because the maths doesn't work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Johnny.
Okay, any other points on that? It is complicated, and I had to read the very, very good explanation in the art scroll and all the notes in the art scroll. I had to read it several times before I got my head around it, and I hope that I was able to explain it at least partially. But if you want to go into it in more detail, then have a look at the art scroll explanation. It's very good. You might have to read it a few times, but it's worth it. And as for next week, it's really an interesting thing. I'm going to read what Ephraim Glatt has got to say in a bit more detail. I only got about 2/3 of the way through the article, and then I had to come on to the shir. So next week, please God, we will see why a unanimous verdict in a capital case, the chap walks free. Okay, see you next week.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Bye,
very much. Thank you. Bye.
Mazel tov, Michael. How's baby doing?
Fine, as far as we know. Well, we'll find out tomorrow anyway.
Oh, you're not there yet. Okay.
No, we're going back crack of dawn